Can web-fueled violence be stopped? Radical hate manifestos spread over the internet have often been followed by killing sprees. Government and tech companies are coming under mounting pressure to take action. Is there a correct balance between censoring violent content and maintaining freedom of speech? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. From the weekend shootings in the United States to the mosque attacks in New Zealand and many more besides, they are all linked to websites which allow hate and radical speech. The suspects thought to have shared their manifestos before carrying out their murderous attacks. They didn't use browsers we all log into every day, but a deeper, darker layer of the internet where you can hide your identity and location, be anonymous and difficult to track. The subterfuge raises questions about the responsibility of tech companies and websites to control what can be posted. Governments are also exploring how to regulate the internet. The US president has highlighted the internet danger following Saturday's shooting in El Paso. At least 20 people were killed after a hate-filled document against Hispanic Americans was posted online.
The shooter in El Paso posted a manifesto online consumed by racist hate. In one voice, our nation must condemn racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. These sinister ideologies must be defeated. Hate has no place in America. We must recognize that the internet has provided a dangerous avenue to radicalize disturbed minds and perform demented acts. We must shine light on the dark recesses of the internet and stop mass murders before they start.
Let's take a look at recent attempts to counter online hate speech. Following the mosque attacks in March, New Zealand and France presented what's called the Christchurch Call. 18 governments supported the non-binding pledge aimed at eliminating terrorist and violent extremist content online. The US government declined. But all major American tech companies signed up to it. Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube have banned many accounts linked to fake news and hate speech. Following the El Paso attack, a network provider blocked the anonymous message board 8chan. The Walmart shooting suspect is the third this year to upload hate-filled documents before attacks. Let's bring in our guest. In Washington, D.C., Brian Hughes is a professor at the American University and fellow at the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right, where he studies extremism and digital technology. In Berlin, Caroline Sinders is online harassment researcher fellow at both Harvard Kennedy School and Mozilla Foundation. In New York, Ryan Broderick is a senior reporter for BuzzFeed News, covering online platforms and web culture. Welcome to all. Brian, talk us through what could possibly be the best way to end online hate speech.
Well, it's somewhat out of our hands. There's a vast array of pressures, public pressure, financial pressure, and law enforcement pressure that are, as you said, pushing these sites, such as 8chan, further and further to the margins of the web. First, we saw extremist groups being banned from mainstream social media. As a response, they began to develop their own platform clones that mimicked sites like Twitter and Facebook. But these clones relied on their own set of internet web services to provide protection and hosting. As we're seeing, however, after events such as the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting and now the El Paso Walmart attack, the companies that provide these services are themselves severing business ties, which is leading the extremist media ecosystem further and further to the margins of what we might call the regular internet. And at a certain point, I think that these pressures of public outcry, financial pressure, and legal oversight are apt to force these groups, as you said, onto the dark web. And when that happens, and I think it's a question of when rather than if, we absolutely have to have strategies already in place to avoid events like we've seen this past week.
Caroline, the reason why I'm asking this question about whether there is a way to end this poison online is we know what is happening and who is involved. But therefore, people are asking questions about whether there is a lack of political will from government, or is it just purely a technical issue that has to be overcome before moving forward?
Thank you so much for that question. I think it's a mixture of both. And let's take a step back and sort of look holistically maybe at the problem. Working as a researcher in civil society, it is harder to begin to even try to critique the technical infrastructure of social networks like Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, because there is not a lot of transparency into the deeper designs of those systems when we think about content moderation. I would say, though, major mainstream platforms like Facebook and Twitter actually do have pretty good hate speech policy. Rather, it's seeing it enacted writ large across many different countries. There is robust hate speech laws here in Germany, and we do see that somewhat affected more on Twitter. There are examples, too, of people changing their location on the gaming streaming platform Twitch to be able to Germany to filter out different kinds of hate speech insignias. Really, what I think is important to sort of look at this moment is it is hard to provide, I think, suggestions or a clear pathway forward when there's such little transparency into content moderation systems that are analyzing things like hate speech. On the opposite side, though, I think it's also hard to sort of call for regulation from country to country. This is where I think when we start to look at different policies that are being passed in the European Union and inside of Parliament, GDPR is something that looks extremely hopeful, right? The way that we're starting to look at how content is being regulated inside of a space like the European Union, we could potentially see something like that around hate speech and content moderation.
We'll go on.
Though one thing I want to quickly highlight, though, is Facebook as a mainstream platform is quite different than 8chan, which is not a mainstream social network. And it is important in these conversations, policy-wise, to separate those two. We
will go more in details about what should be done at the legal framework and examples set by other countries. Brian, now 8chan has become the focal point of for those asking for the flow of this hate speech to be disrupted online. And 8chan allows for unmoderated community, which basically means that you can go there anonymously and do whatever you want to do and post whatever you want to do. From a technical perspective, at least to someone like me or to our viewers, it's simple. Shut down the platform and therefore it's over.
Right. The issue is, and I want to point out something that I had heard earlier said on this program, which is that the idea that this might be some sort of dark web or some sort of fringe of the internet. It's not. 8chan is a pretty basic website. It's you go on to it and you write whatever you want, and then people write whatever they want, and that's the whole thing. Any website can radicalize the way 8chan did. It's not like a Facebook or a Twitter or an Instagram that has an algorithm that's moderating content or has any real moderators at all. It's just a website. It's just a comment section. So from a technical standpoint, there's nothing particularly malicious about it. It's just that because it's so free and open, it's a huge draw for extremist content and for radicalization. But there's nothing particularly nefarious about the website itself. It was started as a message board to talk about anime.
Brian, so is technology the way to tackle this issue? Because we've faced such problems in the past. You shut down 8chan, and 8chan could move towards a new spin-off, or other companies would step in. So we're back to square one. My question is to Brian, sorry.
Yes. Yes, if there's a technical solution to this, I think it has yet to be engineered. I think that really the best hope we currently have lies in civic watchdog groups, and to the extent that it's legal for the government to oversee and investigate the content and the users of this, then that strategy, although government's hands are largely tied, and sometimes with good reason.
Caroline?
Sure. One thing I want to highlight, I believe, to riff on sort of what Brian and Ryan are both saying, The thing about 8chan is, it's true, it's a board-based communication platform. We could call it a social network. It is just comments. The thing about it is it has almost no moderation rules outside of posting copyrighted material or child pornography. And that's what makes it different than 4chan, which it's a clone of. 4chan in, I believe it was 2013, started passing rules around doxing and harassment related to the harassment campaign Gamergate. Similar with Reddit, which has Reddit and has a specific kind of rule structure. It's not always enacted, but what they do have are content policy and terms of service agreements that exist inside of those spaces. I think it's more fair to group 8chan into the space of the Daily Stormer, and I bring that up as an example specifically because in Cloudflare's blog post, they mentioned both cutting service to the Daily Stormer and cutting service to 8chan. These weren't websites that existed on the dark web, they exist on our clear web, on our actual internet. And they will reappear back on the clear web. They will probably find some other service provider. But what's important is that and Google has delisted, for example, Google search results to 8chan previous before their takedown, and I believe same to the Daily Stormer. The amount of friction you add for a regular user to find these sites is important. And this is what I think the term and the idea behind deplatforming is so important.
Okay.
If you make it harder for people to find the site, you make it harder for other people to be radicalized and to join those sites.
I see your point.
And that's like the important argument here.
Mr. Broderick, you've mentioned the fact that the lines are blurred between what was considered before a fringe social media platform and the mainstream one. But what 8chan, the problem is that they are protected by content delivery and security networks. And these different operators within the whole spectrums are saying basically that we don't have a sense of clarity about how to move forward, and ultimately we cannot afford to be on our own the arbiter in an uncharted territory. It's up to the government and to the other international organizations to tell us what should be done before we can step into this new domain.
That's right. And it's similar to the conversations that happened around moderating ISIS about 5 or 6 years ago. I think a lot of these private companies are waiting for government bodies to step in and say, okay, this is what legally constitutes white nationalism, and this is our federal policy on it. The issue that we're seeing, and we're probably going to see this start pretty soon, is that you can knock down 8chan all you want. You can remove services from it. The poison that infected it isn't gone. It's not going anywhere. I think it is safe to say that the internet is a more radical and more polarized space than it was 10 years ago. In fact, this weekend, there was a second shooter who was heavily involved in the grindcore punk community. He was a, person who would share, let's say, far left or anti-fascist material on the internet. That's not what radicalized him. That's not what happened to him. It's that you have a generation of incredibly angry men who are using the internet to socialize with each other in completely unmoderated spaces. As long as unmoderated spaces exist, the male violence that we're seeing in not just America, but in every country on earth is going to continue. And I think that every time we have this conversation about can we knock down a website with some sort of technical fix, well, we need to talk about what the technical fix is for a generation of men who are carrying out this sort of violence on a scale that we don't seem to want to deal with. And I think that seems to get blurred in the conversation every time we talk about this sort of thing, because I think talking about moderating security infrastructure for 8chan is an easier thing to talk about, and it requires less soul searching.
Mr. Hughes, I mean, if you look into past experiences, the EU, along with the main tech networks, companies, particularly Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, have signed a code of conduct in 2016. The Germans are pursuing a very aggressive policy. If you don't flag up content within 24 hours, you might pay a fine that could amount to something like 50 million euros. And the French are saying, sorry, sometimes we need you companies to hand over the digital identity of some of those people who are spreading that venom online. Otherwise, you might face problems. Why aren't the Americans doing the same thing?
Well, the American government, at least, its hands are somewhat tied as well. These companies, like 8chan, are protected under what's called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which essentially states that so long as they don't edit and don't curate their content, as long as they only provide a neutral platform, then they're not legally liable for any of the content that flows through it, except, as was said before, for child pornography and previously copyrighted material. I think that what is happening in the EU is an excellent example that the United States should be seriously looking at and following, and that tech companies in the United States should be voluntarily adopting. Some of what happens on the internet follows what's called the California emissions effect, where cars, the metaphor is that cars built in California have lower emissions, so therefore cars all over the U.S. have lower emissions. The standards and practices that Silicon Valley undertakes have a way of diffusing outward and becoming larger standards that companies use internationally.
Okay.
So I think there's an appeal to the conscience of these corporations that has to be made to the extent that they can be reached.
But at the same time, and this is my question to Caroline, you have critics saying that the caveat to this new codes of conduct that have been established over the last few years is basically they give the tech companies more say over deciding what is legal and not legal, and this could further undermine the freedom of expression. Is there any middle ground over here?
Just to note, I'm not a legal scholar, but I always hesitate at any kind of argument that is sort of, if we do X, it begets Y, because let's work with specific cases here. And in this very example, we're not talking about all tech companies. We are talking about 8chan, and we're talking about a site that has had issues with child pornography. We're talking about a site that has almost no content moderation tools and has almost no moderation rules. This is a very different website than, per se, Facebook. Facebook does have robust policies on things like hate speech and online harassment, but again, it's seeing it enacted at large. The bigger point here and problem, I think, to highlight, and I think Ryan is the one highlighting this, is how does this keep replicating and happening in spaces like 8chan and 4chan? And what are the ways around it? What are the rules around it? And I think it's important to look at not just how are we defining hate speech, though that is an extremely important part of this conversation. It's important to think about when we define that hate speech, what is to be done about it? What is the systems within that? It's one thing I want to highlight, for example, when Reddit had the subreddit, the alt-right, which they removed in February 2017, that on the sidebar describing the rules of that subreddit, because each subreddit, like 4chan and 8chan, the creator can be the moderator. They specifically called themselves promoters of white identity and white nationalism. No one falls into white nationalism accidentally. It's not a thing you ironically are. It's a political ideology of the far right. It is serious. It is about the supremacy of the white race and white identity. So there's nothing ironic or satire about that. And I use those words specifically when we start to look at the subcultures on 4chan and 8chan that deal with irony. And then satire is also important to highlight when we start to look at things through an American context, American relationship to things like freedom of speech.
Mr. Broderick, there is a new trend in the US in particular, but it has been spreading in different parts of the world, basically about, which is white nationalist extremism, using different ideologies, different narratives, and raising the issue that whites are under threat by different ethnicities and other people of color. And this seems to be a divisive issue in the United States of America. Don't you think that because of its nature, people don't seem to be all on board about the need to say clearly that the biggest problem that the US is facing now is white nationalist extremism?
Yes, I do agree with that. I think right now in America, it is incredibly complicated to have that conversation, to figure out where the line between what we think of as traditional conservative values separates into the far right, and then, let's say, the far right separates into white nationalism, which I would consider more extremist. But this conversation is happening not just in America, it's happening in every country on earth. And I want to make a really important point about this. It happened across Europe over the last 3-4 years. You saw this in France, in Sweden, in Germany, in the UK. But it's also happening in Asia and in Southeast Asia. It's happening with Hindu nationalism under the Modi administration in India. The things that we're seeing with 8chan right now have happened in South Korea with the message board Il-Bay Storehouse, or in Japan with Japanese nationalism and the message board that inspired 4chan, which is 2chan or Ni-chan. These issues are endemic in almost every online society on Earth right now. And I think that having these conversations and focusing on one particular country is what we kind of trip over every time, because what we could be doing is what we're kind of doing right now, which is talking about how different countries are facing this problem. And maybe if America was a little more open to acknowledging that there is a problem and that this problem is one that everyone is sharing, we can start talking about how we can address it on a systemic level that can actually start to fix things, right?
I see your point. Mr. Hughes, the reason why we're talking about the need for the US to step in, if you remember back into after 9/11, the Americans were at the forefront telling the world that, you know what, with Al-Qaeda and with ISIS later, we need to take action, particularly with draining the resources of these groups online, financially, to be able to defeat them. And we've seen what happened later. Now, when it comes to white nationalist extremism, New York Times is drawing parallels between the two, between ISIS and white nationalist extremism. And they are saying why, in a way or another, why aren't the Americans doing exactly what they did with ISIS and Al-Qaeda? And therefore, they might find an answer to the questions they face.
Yes, the Islamist extremism and white nationalism are actually very similar in a lot of ways, particularly in respect to angry young men radicalizing each other. There are two reasons why the United States hasn't been able to go after white nationalist terrorists the way it was able to go after Al-Qaeda and ISIS. First of all, there are no legal designations for domestic terrorism. There are certain designations that allow law enforcement to investigate what could be domestic terror groups, but because of the political implications, the government doesn't recognize domestic terror groups in the same way that it recognizes foreign terror groups. At the same time, one of the reasons why the United States government can't go after far-right extremists is because the beliefs and the rhetoric that these extremists are espousing is very similar to the beliefs and rhetoric that are on display every day by this presidential administration and many on the right in Congress. One of the issues with moderating white nationalist content online is that many of the algorithms that were applied to, say, ISIS or Al-Qaeda can't be applied to white nationalists.
I see your point.
Because they would sweep up too many mainstream Republicans in the process.
And for this, I would like to ask the same question to Caroline about whether it's fair to say that while there's this call about the need to clamp down on those individuals on the fringe, others are saying basically we should be targeting the role models, the politicians, leaders who came to power espousing the same ideology, which is now becoming somehow, in a way or another, a mainstream narrative in different parts of the world, the US in particular, but also now gaining ground in Europe.
I think right, and that has been definitely an argument. I would say the bigger thing when I think about mainstream social networks, drawing a line right between mainstream social networks and 8chan, is that there isn't a lot of transparency around when content is taken down, why, how, when it violated a policy. And that's the same thing if we look at Richard Spencer or David Duke's Twitter accounts, right? David Duke being the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. Why are their Twitter accounts online still? That is a very good and profound question, of which there is not a clear answer from Twitter and their policy team. But that's something I would love to know the answer to. Why do those accounts stay up and other accounts are taken down? I think it's important to also highlight as well, again, what does it mean to self-identify as a white nationalist and to say something on a more mainstream platform? For example, I do believe BuzzFeed reported this, that Facebook was going to take down white nationalist and white supremacy groups, Facebook groups, but some of those groups still stand. At least that was from an article from a couple of months ago to a year ago. But these are deeper questions to ask, and I do think perhaps we should come back and focus maybe on something like 8chan.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time.
That had no policy.
We'll definitely revisit this issue with you in the near future. Thanks to Brian Hughes, Caroline Sinders, and Brian Broderick. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem, Ahelbarra, and the whole team here in Doha. Bye for now.